The Red Sea had been quiet for exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds when the first contact appeared on the SPY-1D scope at 2:09 a.m. Not quiet in the way of peace. The region had not known that kind of quiet in years, but quiet in the way of a held breath, a deliberate pause in the rhythm of electronic emissions, radar sweeps, and encrypted transmissions that the Houthi forces ashore had been broadcasting with increasing discipline over the preceding weeks. The electronic warfare officer aboard USS Carney had been tracking that pattern of silence for 2 days. He had flagged it in 3 successive watch reports. He had been right. The Carney was operating independently that night, detached from the main strike group to establish a northern barrier position in the corridor between the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the approaches to Aqaba. Her mission was straightforward in concept and brutal in execution. She would be the first thing any inbound threat encountered, the outermost layer of the defensive net, and she would hold that position alone with whatever was in her magazine. The crew of 331 had been at sea for 92 days. The ship's combat information center smelled of cold coffee, machine oil, and the particular human exhaustion that sets in when a crew has been standing 6 and 6 watch rotations long enough that the difference between day and night becomes irrelevant. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is not small by any measure a civilian would apply to a ship. She displaces nearly 10,000 tons at full combat load, her hull cutting the Red Sea swells at a lean, knife-edged angle that her designers spent years optimizing in wave tank simulations. But against the geography of the region, the wide contested expanse of open water between the Yemeni coast to the east, and the shipping lanes that connect the Suez Canal to the Indian Ocean, she was a single point, a single node, a single set of radar arrays and missile cells standing in the path of whatever the night decided to send. The nearest friendly surface combatant was 46 nautical miles to the south. The nearest air support was an FA-18 on alert status aboard the carrier, 11 minutes out at full afterburner. 11 minutes in the geometry of ballistic missile defense is an eternity. The electronic warfare officer had been watching the Houthi emission pattern for 61 hours. The pattern had a rhythm, active radar sweeps, encrypted burst transmissions, the telemetry handshakes that preceded every previous launch in the campaign. He had logged the pattern. He had built a signature library on his workstation that had no official designation in any system he was authorized to access, because he had assembled it himself from raw intercept data during watch hours and off-watch hours and the 30-minute periods between meal breaks when most of his peers were on their bunks. When the emissions went quiet at 2:06 a.m., not reduced, not shifted, but absent, as if someone had pulled a power cable from every transmitter on the Yemeni coast simultaneously. He recognized it not as a technical anomaly, but as a deliberate act. Someone on the ground had issued an emissions control order. The Houthi forces were going radio silent before a coordinated launch. He had his handset at his ear before the silence had lasted 30 seconds. At 2:09 a.m., the contact was ballistic. 1 track. High angle, steep trajectory consistent with a medium-range ballistic missile fired from a concealed launcher in the highlands west of Sana'a. The tactical action officer had the engagement authority before the second pulse returned. The SM-3 was in the air at 2:09:38 a.m. By 2:10:14 a.m. there were 5 tracks. By 2:10:51 a.m. there were 9. By 2:11:07 a.m. there were 14. The Carney's magazine held 96 vertical launch system cells. Not all of them were loaded with interceptors. Some carried land attack variants. Some carried anti-submarine weapons. But the combat load for this deployment had been weighted toward air defense. Heavily weighted. Someone in the planning chain had made the right call 6 months ago in a logistics review that most of the attendees had considered routine. That call was now the difference between a ship that could fight and a ship that could not. The tactical action officer began sequencing engagements at 2:11 a.m. The geometry was not in his favor. 14 tracks inbound on overlapping trajectories with time-of-flight variations that created intercept windows separated by as little as 19 seconds. The engagement sequencing software ran its optimization calculation in 2.3 seconds and produced a firing solution that would commit 11 interceptors to engage the highest priority tracks in the most efficient sequence. The TAO reviewed it in the time it takes to exhale, approved it, and the VLS cells began firing. The sound of a VLS launch in combat conditions is not the dramatic cinematic roar that most people imagine. It is a sharp, compressed bark, the simultaneous ignition of a rocket motor inside a steel canister, followed immediately by the rushing white column of exhaust that streaks vertically from the deck and bends toward the horizon as the guidance system pulls the interceptor onto its intercept vector. When multiple cells fire in sequence, the sound becomes a rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat, each beat marking the departure of another $3 million missile toward another $3 million problem. The crew felt every launch through the deck plates. 11 times in 4 minutes, the Carney shuddered. The first 6 intercepts were textbook. The tracks resolved into debris fields at altitude, the kinetic energy of each collision producing a brief thermal signature that the infrared sensors cataloged with clinical precision. The 7th intercept was partially successful. The warhead was disrupted, not neutralized, and the fragmented casing continued on a modified trajectory that took it into the water 200 meters off the port bow in a column of white spray that rose 30 feet above the wave surface. The 8th track evaded. The intercept missed by a margin that the post-engagement analysis would later identify as the result of a terminal guidance maneuver, a last-second course correction that the Houthi operators had introduced manually, watching the engagement on a data link feed from a passive radar positioned 40 kilometers from the launch site. Someone on the other side understood intercept geometry. Someone had been studying the engagement logs from previous operations and had identified the precise moment in a missile's terminal descent when a guidance update would have the highest probability of defeating an SM-3 intercept. The 8th missile struck the water 600 meters astern. The shockwave arrived 2 seconds later. It was not the detonation that caused the damage. It was the pressure wave propagating through the water column and into the Carney's hull. The ship's engineering plant was not designed to absorb a near miss of that magnitude at that range. The main engine room, an enclosed space deep in the ship's machinery spaces housing the 4 LM-2500 gas turbine engines that drove the Carney through the water at 30 knots, was subject to a lateral shock load that had not been part of any design specification. A high-pressure fuel line in the No. 3 engine space developed a fracture along a weld seam that had passed every inspection since the ship's last yard availability 18 months earlier. The fracture was not visible to the eye. The engine continued to run for 11 seconds after the fracture opened. At 2:16 a.m., the fuel vapor that had been accumulating in the lower section of the No. 3 engine room reached its ignition threshold. The fire that resulted was not explosive in the Hollywood sense. There was no fireball, no dramatic rupture of the hull. It was worse than that. It was a sustained, high-temperature hydrocarbon fire in an enclosed metal space, fed by pressurized fuel from a fractured line, producing temperatures that exceeded the tolerance of the fire-resistant coatings on the surrounding bulkheads within 60 seconds of ignition. The heat in the space became fatal to unprotected personnel in under 2 minutes. The No. 3 engine shut down automatically when its protection system detected the temperature anomaly. The Carney lost 25% of her propulsion and, more critically, 25% of the electrical generation capacity that fed her combat systems. The damage control officer received the fire report at 2:16 and 12 seconds a.m. He was already in motion. The DC teams assigned to the machinery spaces had been at general quarters since the first missile track appeared. They were in position, suited, equipped with oxygen-breathing apparatus and charged hose lines. Not because anyone had predicted a fuel fire, but because 92 days of sustained combat operations had produced a level of material readiness that goes beyond procedure and becomes reflex. The lead DC petty officer had fought a fuel fire in a training evolution at the Center for Naval Engineering 18 months earlier. He had failed the evolution the first time. He had gone back and passed it 3 days later. He knew in a way that could not be communicated in a briefing or captured in a manual, that a fuel fire in a machinery space rewards only one approach. Containment of the fuel source first, suppression second, and no hesitation between the two steps. The DC Central Station was the nerve center of the ship's survival infrastructure. A space no larger than a utility closet, crammed with hydraulic manifold handles, sound-powered telephone trunks, damaged status boards running on independent battery power, and the laminated emergency card binders that represented decades of institutional knowledge compressed into waterproof pages that could be read by flashlight in a flooded passageway. The damage control officer planted himself at the central board and began managing information the way a trauma surgeon manages a patient in crisis. Prioritize, delegate, verify, move forward. The fire in the number 3 engine room was the immediate threat to the ship's survival. The 6 remaining inbound missile tracks on the tactical display 2 decks above him were the immediate threat to the ship's continued existence. Both required action simultaneously. There was no sequence. There was only execution. The passageway outside the number 3 engine room was filling with heat that was not yet visible but was absolutely perceptible. A radiating wall of temperature that pushed against the DC team's approach. The thermal imaging camera read 420 degrees Celsius on the access hatch surface. The petty officer second class leading the approach team did not need the camera to know the space was inaccessible. He needed it to confirm what he already understood so that he could justify, in the post-incident documentation he was already composing in the back of his mind, the decision he was about to make. He identified the fuel isolation valve on the manifold in the adjacent passageway. He identified the valve handle orientation. He noted the inverted indicator. He did the math from memory and turned the wheel. The number 3 engine room was inaccessible. The temperature on the access hatch read 420 degrees Celsius on the thermal imaging camera held by the DC Petty Officer second class. Standing in the passageway outside, he did not open the hatch. He identified the fuel isolation valve on the hull-mounted manifold located in the adjacent passageway, a valve that could shut off fuel flow to the number 3 engine without entering the fire space, and turned it manually. Both hands, full body weight, 12 turns of the valve wheel in the wrong direction because the valve had last been operated during the yard availability, and someone had reinstalled the handle indicator in the inverted position. He did not stop to verify the indicator. He felt the valve seat against its stop and knew from the change in vibration through the deck that the fuel pressure in the line had dropped. At 2:17:44 a.m., 92 seconds after ignition, the fire began to lose its fuel source, but the CIC was already tracking 6 more inbound tracks. The 14th missile, the one that the engagement sequencing software had assessed as lowest priority due to its flight path placing it on a trajectory toward a sector of the formation with no high-value assets, had executed a mid-course correction at 2:16 a.m. It was now tracking directly at the Carney's hull. It was 4 minutes and 20 seconds from impact. The Carney's combat system was running on 75% power. The TAO had 2 functioning interceptor cells remaining in the engagement sequence. The remaining 6 tracks from the original salvo had been addressed by SM-2 missiles and by the ESSM battery. 5 had been neutralized. 1 had impacted the water inside the defensive perimeter at a range that left the crew with ringing ears and water spray across the forward optical sensors. The 14th track was the one that had been designed to survive everything else. The Houthi planners, or more precisely, the Iranian military advisors who had been embedded with Houthi missile forces in the mountain positions north of Hodeidah, had built the salvo around a simple principle. Saturate the defensive system, accept losses on the first 13 rounds, and use the data from each intercept to refine the 14th's trajectory into the gap. The Tau fired both remaining interceptors at the 14th track at 2:18:30 a.m. The first missed. The terminal guidance correction that had defeated the earlier intercept was applied again. The same data link, the same operator, the same 11-degree adjustment at the same point in the descent profile. The interceptor flew through empty air 60 meters to the left of the target. The second interceptor received updated targeting data from the SPY-1D in the final 3 seconds of its flight. The radar operators had not been idle. The electronic warfare technician had been watching the Houthi data link signal for 17 minutes and had, in the time between the first and second interceptor launches, identified the frequency and timing pattern of the terminal guidance uplink. He could not block it. The Carney's jamming assets were not optimized for that frequency band at that geometry. But he could predict when the next correction command would be transmitted, and he passed that timing to the fire control team with 5 seconds to spare. The fire control technician adjusted the interceptor's terminal seeker gate by a factor that had no name in any official procedure. It was a manual input, entered on a keyboard in the Combat Information Center, by a sailor who had been awake for 21 hours and whose hands did not shake. The intercept occurred at an altitude of 160 meters. The range to the hull at the moment of detonation was 812 meters. The pressure wave arrived simultaneously with the sound. Every sailor on the weather decks felt it as a physical impact against their chest. In the CIC, overhead panels flexed and returned. One display monitor flickered, stabilized, and continued displaying data. The debris pattern from the intercept detonation scattered across a wide arc over the ship's bow, several fragments impacting the forecastle deck and leaving a pattern of dents and gouges in the non-skid coating that the damage assessment teams would document for 4 hours after the engagement. No penetration, no fire, no casualties from the final intercept debris. Below decks, in the number 3 engine room, the fire had been reduced to isolated hotspots by 2:24 a.m. The DC teams entered the space in 2-man pairs with charged lines and aqueous film-forming foam at 2:26 a.m. The space was cleared of active combustion at 2:41 a.m., 25 minutes after ignition. The number 3 gas turbine was destroyed. The fuel line and associated systems required replacement. The electrical distribution panel that served the space required complete rebuild. The space itself would need a structural survey before it could be certified for operations. The Carney was still underway. She was operating at reduced propulsion with reduced electrical generation, with a machinery space secured and under post-fire monitoring, with a crew that had been at general quarters for 47 minutes. She was still the barrier. She was still the net. At 3:14 a.m., the fleet commander's message traffic cleared the backup communication system. The strike group was repositioning. 2 destroyers and a cruiser were closing the Carney's position. The barrier would be reinforced. The Carney would be escorted to a logistics rendezvous point where emergency repairs could begin from the tender position 60 miles to the south. But first, the duty engineer needed to restore sufficient electrical generation to keep the combat systems online. The number 2 generator was fully functional. The number 4 generator had tripped in the power fluctuation following the fire. The DC team in the aft machinery room had been working the restart sequence since 2:19 a.m. 11 minutes of manual procedures in a space that smelled of overheated metal and the residual chemical burn of suppression agent drifting through the ventilation system from 3 compartments forward. The generator restart manual specified a minimum cooldown period of 15 minutes before restart attempt following an unplanned trip. The DC team had waited 9 minutes, not because they disregarded the procedure, but because the petty officer in charge of the space had placed his bare hand on the turbine casing at the 9-minute mark, assessed the heat distribution pattern, and made the judgment that the variance was within the tolerance that the procedure's 15-minute buffer was designed to protect. He was operating inside the logic of the procedure, not against it. The number 4 generator came online at 2:30 a.m. The Carney's combat systems returned to full power. The SPY-1D resumed its full rotation cycle. The CIC, which had been operating on reduced display capability for 14 minutes, flickered back to full operational status. No new tracks appeared. The Air Defense Coordinator transmitted a status report to the Fleet Commander at 2:34 a.m. The message was 9 lines long. It listed expenditures, system status, personnel status, and damage assessment in the precise, unemotional language of official naval communication. A language designed to convey maximum information in minimum characters over circuits that might degrade at any moment. Reading it, a staff officer 300 miles away in the Fleet Operations Center would understand in clinical terms what had happened aboard the Carney in the preceding 25 minutes. What they would not understand, and what no status report could transmit, was the quality of the silence that settled over the CIC after the transmission completed. The silence of a crew that had been asked to absorb everything and had absorbed it, and was now sitting with the receipts. The silence after combat is a specific kind of silence. It is not peaceful. It has a texture. A physical quality produced by the transition from extreme sensory overload to the absence of immediate threat, while the body continues producing the chemicals that were serving a survival function 30 seconds earlier. In the Carney's CIC, that silence arrived at approximately 2:32 a.m. and settled over a crew that had just successfully defended a ship against the largest coordinated ballistic missile salvo ever directed at a single U.S. Navy surface combatant in this theater. They did not celebrate. There was too much work. Here are the numbers as they stand when the story is over. 14 inbound ballistic missiles in a single coordinated salvo. 11 SM-3 interceptors expended. 4 SM-2 engagements. 2 ESSM terminal defense shots. 1 fuel fire in the number 3 engine space. 25 minutes from ignition to suppression. 812 meters, the closest intercept detonation to the hull. 9 minutes. The DC team's calculated deviation from the mandated cool-down procedure. 0 hull penetrations. 0 fatal outcomes among the crew. 331 sailors who held the barrier position until the net closed around them. What the salvo designers had calculated correctly was the mathematics of saturation. Enough simultaneous tracks, enough terminal guidance updates, enough variation in approach vectors, and the probability of at least one penetrating the defensive envelope approaches certainty. What they had not calculated was the human variable, the fire control technician who mapped the guidance uplink timing by hand, the DC petty officer who seated the fuel isolation valve with both hands and 12 turns without verifying the indicator, the duty engineer who put his palm on a hot turbine casing and made a decision that no algorithm would have approved. The numbers said the 14th missile should have reached the hull. The crew said otherwise. A ship is not saved by the systems that protect it. It is saved by the people who refuse to accept the moment when those systems reach their limit. When the math runs out, the only thing left is the decision made by a sailor with 21 hours behind him and no margin for error in front of him. That is what held the barrier that night. That is what always holds it.